if you're painting on location, in this case I'm starting with a preliminary pencil sketch, which is not always what I would do, but in more complicated, exact sort of topics like an airplane, we'll generally spend a little more time on drawing because your painting doesn't really get better than the drawing. So if you spend time there, it's usually well invested. And I find it's helpful when working with complex architecture or aircraft or any man-made objects to use a concept called drawing through, where you're taking the shapes and you're thinking of them as three-dimensional objects rather than flat subjects, which is how we generally view it. I'm not getting too involved with ruler work or anything, and in some cases I might do that, but I think I'm just gonna more focus on keeping it loose, working with the color. There's a really interesting color theme of complementary colors of almost an orangey yellow and a blue. So that's about as far as I'm going to take the pencil drawing. I'm going to get some paint out and start moving some paint around. This sketch is going to be done with a combination of watercolor and opaque gouache. So this is all paint that I've squeezed into a watercolor tin. This is Winsor & Newton paint. And how I usually start out is I just wet my entire page of my watercolor just so I can activate the fibers. And this is sort of like laying in the tea or staining the paper a little bit. Just take some of that surface water off. It's helpful to move things along as quickly as possible. So once this watercolor is dried up, I'm going to start adding opaque gouache, which is water-soluble opaque watercolor paint. I like the gouache paint because it allows me to work kind of like I would work in the studio with my opaque oils or acrylics. Watercolors are great, but you're at the mercy of their ability to dry quick. With the cloud cover, we could be waiting a long time for a lot of these passages to dry. I'm just painting some background shapes in. These are the main water masses, and I'm trying to kind of create a little bit of a water gradient just to kind of keep it a little bit more interesting. So at this point, once I'm kind of happy with my background, I'll move into the darks. And I usually like to start all paintings with the darks. It kind of helps me establish my extreme values, what I'm measuring against. And then I'll generally move into the next darkest thing that I kind of see, which are some of the blue parts of the airplane. So I'm just gonna work with that now. Kind of just filling in shapes that I see and slowly build this jigsaw puzzle up. Using the Payne's Gray is a really quick access to gray if you need it. And I can always warm it up with raw sienna or some of that gamboge yellow if I need to. At this point, I'm just moving into the shady side of the airplane where the sun's not getting to. And I'll kind of gradate this in a little bit. It's always best to kind of pick a mid-tone that you can kind of go a little bit darker with and a little bit lighter with. So you're right in the middle rather than go too dark and have to back off. I'm gonna start filling in sort of the whiter whites of the scene where the sun is hitting it. I'm gonna keep away from using direct white. I'm gonna put a little bit of warmth into that. And gouache is a really, really nice medium to use because in some senses it's like oil. It's very blendable when you want it to be. Once it dries, I can reactivate it again with wet paint and create soft edges. I always kind of just take it one shade lighter than I think it needs to be, and then when it dries, it goes a bit darker. And now I'm at a point where I can move into smaller brushes and start blending some of these shapes a little bit. And use this water just to reactivate this part where the shadow kind of softens and where the roll of the fuselage of this airplane starts to roll under the belly here. I can soften that. And I'll often move back and forth from shapes that are in the front to shapes that are in the back. It's sort of a necessary thing to do when you're working with opaque colors. You'll notice that when you're painting outdoors, things will disappear because the light changes and things will reappear. So when you see something, just grab it. I find it helpful to just let details be something that happens as a result of the time you have. And now I can start working on some highlights of the blue part of the wing, which is going to be fun. Always be careful that you don't put too much emphasis on anything around the edges or anywhere you don't want the eye to go, the ways you take people out of your picture frame. I opted to more or less go really close to pure white here for some of these highlights because my warmth really darkened these parts up when it dried. Usually this is where I'll take a watercolor pen into it or any sort of drawing pen just to kind of clean up some edges before I depart. And with that, I'll probably call it quits. That gives enough illustration into the scene that I kind of know where I was, and I can just make a little note at the bottom